Grace Calder never expected gratitude for saving two terrified Blackfoot girls from armed men hunting them across the Montana prairie. She certainly never expected what happened the next morning when their father, a warrior named Gochevan, arrived at her cabin door. He didn't come with thanks or empty words. What he did instead would bind their fates together in ways that would shake the entire territory, pit them against the most powerful rancher in Montana, and force Grace to choose between the safe, quiet life she knew and a battle that would change everything. Some debts, she would learn, are paid not with words, but with blood, courage, and an unbreakable alliance. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The morning after the rescue dawned clear and cold, the kind of Montana morning where the air bit at exposed skin and every breath came out as frost. And Grace Calder stood at her cabin window watching the horizon with Samuel's revolver still in her hand, the weight of it now familiar after a sleepless night spent listening for the return of those riders who had promised vengeance and the sheriff's authority. The two Blackfoot girls had finally fallen asleep just before dawn, huddled together on Grace's bed while she kept vigil in the wooden chair by the door. And now in the pale light she could see their small forms breathing steadily beneath the quilt she had tucked around them, their dark hair spread across the pillow. And she felt a fierce protectiveness rise in her chest that surprised her with its intensity. She had been alone for 2 years since Samuel's death, alone with her grief and her struggling homestead, and the endless work that came with trying to survive on the high prairie, and she had grown accustomed to the solitude, even found a kind of peace in it. But looking at these sleeping children who had run to her cabin in terror, she realized how much she had missed having someone to protect, someone to care for beyond herself. The kettle began to whistle on the stove and she moved to silence it quickly, not wanting to wake the girls. And as she poured the hot water into her tin cup, she heard the sound that made her blood run cold, hoofbeats approaching from the east, multiple riders coming at a steady pace. Grace set down the cup and moved to the window, pulling back the corner of the curtain just enough to see out, her hand instinctively finding the revolver again. And what she saw made her pause because this was not the same men from yesterday. A single rider approached her cabin, sitting tall and straight on a paint horse that moved with the confidence of an animal well-trained and well-loved. And the man himself was Blackfoot, his long dark hair bound back with leather cord, his face weathered and strong, his buckskin clothing decorated with intricate beadwork that caught the morning light. He rode alone, which meant either incredible courage or incredible foolishness in this territory, where tensions between settlers and the tribes ran hot and dangerous. And as he drew closer, Grace could see that he carried no weapon in his hands, though a rifle rested in a scabbard on his saddle and a knife hung at his belt. He stopped his horse 20 feet from her door and dismounted with fluid grace, then stood there waiting, his hands visible and empty, his posture respectful but not submissive, and Grace found herself opening the door before she had consciously decided to do so, stepping out into the cold morning air with the revolver held low at her side. "I am Gochevan," the man said in English that carried only the slightest accent, his voice deep and measured, and his dark eyes met hers with an intensity that made her catch her breath. "I have come for my daughters." Grace's hand tightened on the revolver, but she did not raise it. And something in his face, the barely controlled fear beneath the stoic expression, the exhaustion that spoke of a night spent searching, the desperate hope that flickered in his eyes made her lower the gun completely and nod toward the cabin. "They are safe," she said, "sleeping." The relief that washed over Gochevan's face was so profound that Grace felt her own throat tighten with emotion, and she watched as he closed his eyes for a moment, his shoulders sagging slightly as if a great weight had been lifted. And when he opened them again, there was a brightness there that might have been tears, though none fell. "You saved them," he said simply. "The men who chased them, they would have taken them to Kingsley. He wants leverage against my people. He wants us to abandon our hunting grounds near Cold Spring so he can claim the water for himself alone." Grace gestured for him to come inside, and after a moment's hesitation he followed her into the cabin, moving quietly so as not to disturb his sleeping daughters. And when he saw them safe and whole in her bed, his control finally broke, and he knelt beside them, his large, weathered hand reaching out to touch first Cholina's cheek and then Istis's, and Grace turned away to give him privacy in his relief, gratitude. She busied herself with the coffee pot, adding grounds to the boiling water, and trying not to listen to the low murmur of Blackfoot words that Gochevan spoke to his daughters as they woke. their sleepy confusion giving way to joy and then tears as they threw themselves into their father's arms. Grace poured 2 cups of coffee and set them on the table, then retreated to the doorway to give them space, and eventually Gochevan rose and came to her, his daughters clinging to his hands, and the older one, Istas. Grace remembered looked at her with new eyes, no longer filled with fear but with something like wonder. "I owe you a debt," Gochevan said, and there was such weight in those words that Grace understood immediately this was no casual statement but something that bound him by honor and tradition. "My daughters' lives are worth more than anything I possess, and you protected them when you had no obligation to do so. When doing so, put your own life in danger." Grace shook her head, uncomfortable with the formal gratitude. "They are children," she said. "Any decent person would have done the same." "No," Gochevan said flatly. "Not in this territory. Not between our peoples. You know this." And Grace did know it. Had known it even as she fired those shots yesterday. That she was crossing a line that most settlers would never cross. Allying herself with the Blackfoot against white men who claimed legal authority, and the truth of it settled heavy in her stomach like a stone. Gochevan seemed to see her understanding and nodded slowly. "Nathan Kingsley has built a dam at Cold Spring," he continued, his voice hardening with anger. "He diverts the water that has flowed to both our peoples since before memory. The creek that runs through your land and through our hunting grounds, it is dying. Your crops will fail. Our game will leave. Our children will go thirsty. And Kingsley grows rich, selling water rights to those who can pay while those who cannot must watch their land turn to dust." Grace thought of her struggling pump, the water barrel that never seemed to fill properly anymore, the wheat she had planted that struggled to grow, and suddenly it all made terrible sense. "How long has this been happening?" she asked. 6 months, Gochevan replied. "It started slowly. We thought it was drought. But then our scouts found the dam, found Kingsley's men guarding it with rifles, turning away anyone who came too close. We protested to the territorial authorities, but they are in Kingsley's pocket. So we began taking our children to the creek to collect what little water still flows. And yesterday his men tried to take my daughters, to use them as hostages to force my people to sign away our rights to the spring." The pragmatic part of Grace's mind was already calculating the implications of what Gochevan was telling her. The danger she had already placed herself in, and the danger that would only grow if she continued down this path. But the part of her that had lost Samuel to the harsh indifference of this land, the part that had spent 2 years fighting alone to keep her homestead alive, the part that had looked into the terrified eyes of 2 small girls and acted without thinking, that part knew she had already made her choice. "What do you need?" she asked, and Gochevan's eyes widened slightly as if he had not expected such a direct question. "I need allies," he said after a moment. "I need evidence that Kingsley's dam is illegal, that it violates territorial water law. I need witnesses who will testify. And I need—" He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "I need a place where my daughters can be safe while I gather this evidence, because Kingsley will try again to take them." Grace looked at Cholina and Istas, who watched their father with wide, solemn eyes, and she thought of the empty space in her cabin, the silence that had filled it for so long, and she thought of the water that was even now being stolen from her land and from theirs. "They can stay here," she said, "and I will help you gather your evidence." Gochevan stared at her for a long moment, and she could see him weighing her words, measuring her sincerity, and then he nodded once. A sharp, decisive movement. "Then we are allies," he said. "I will protect your property as I protect my own. I will help you maintain your homestead, and together we will stop Kingsley." They shook hands, his grip firm and warm, and Grace felt something shift inside her, some door opening that had been closed for a very long time, and she did not know if it was hope or just foolishness, but she found she did not care. The sound of horses approaching made them both turn toward the window, and Grace's hand went instinctively to the revolver while Gochevan moved to place himself between the door and his daughters, and when Grace looked out, she saw John Novak riding up on his old mare, his weathered face grim, and behind him were 2 other riders she recognized from town. John dismounted stiffly, his bad leg always troubled him in cold weather, and walked to the door with the careful deliberation of a man bearing bad news. "Grace," he called out, You need to hear this." Grace opened the door and John's eyes widened when he saw Gochevan standing inside. But to his credit, the old homesteader just nodded in acknowledgement and continued. "Kingsley's men are spreading word in town that you're harboring fugitives. Sheriff Hollis is coming out here this afternoon with a warrant. They mean to arrest you and take those girls." Grace felt her stomach drop, but Gochevan's hand on her shoulder was steady, grounding. "Let them come," she said, surprised by the steel in her own voice. "Let them try." John looked between them and understanding dawned on his face, and he smiled grimly. "Well then," he said, "I reckon you'll need some help fixing that fence line of yours before the sheriff arrives. Man can't arrest a woman for honest work on her own property." And just like that, Grace understood that she had found another ally, that John Novak, with his failing land and his desperate situation, was willing to stand with her against Kingsley's power. And she felt gratitude wash through her so strong it almost brought tears. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of activity as Gochevan examined Grace's property with the practiced eye of someone who understood land and water, pointing out where her irrigation system had failed and where the natural springs that should have fed her well had gone dry. And with each discovery, the evidence of Kingsley's theft mounted. John worked alongside them, and when Sheriff Hollis finally arrived in the early afternoon with 2 deputies in tow, he found Grace Calder standing on her own porch with John Novak at her right hand and a Blackfoot warrior at her left, and 2 small girls playing in the yard with a rope and a stick as if they had not a care in the world. Hollis was a thick-set man with a red face and small, mean eyes, and he sat his horse with the confidence of someone who believed the law was whatever he said it was. "Grace Calder," he announced loudly, "I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of harboring stolen property and interfering with the lawful recovery of said property." Grace did not move. "Those children are not property," she said clearly. "They are human beings under my protection." "They're Injun brats that belong with their people," Hollis sneered. "Mr. Kingsley has an agreement with the tribal elders about keeping their young'uns away from settler lands. You violated that agreement." "I have made no such agreement," Gochevan said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "I am the father of these children, and I give my consent for them to be here." Hollis's face darkened. "You don't have the authority to consent to nothing, savage. This is civilized territory now." The insult hung in the air, and Grace saw Gochevan's hand move toward his knife, saw the tension coil through his body, and she stepped forward quickly before violence could erupt. "Sheriff," she said, "I am on my own property committing no crime. These children are here with their father's permission. You have no legal standing to arrest me or remove them. I got the law on my side," Hollis spat, "and you got a savage and a broken-down old homesteader. You think that's going to help you?" John Novak spoke up then, his voice mild but his eyes hard. "I think you should know, Sheriff, that I've already sent a telegram to Judge Wainwright in the territorial capital describing this situation. The judge takes a particular interest in sheriffs who overreach their authority. Seems he's already investigating some complaints about you and Mr. Kingsley." The effect of those words on Hollis was immediate and profound. His face went from red to pale and then back to red again, rage and fear warring across his features. "You're making a mistake," he said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "All of you. Kingsley owns this territory and everyone in it. You can't fight him." "We can try," Grace said quietly, and Hollis stared at her for a long moment before jerking his horse's reins and wheeling away, his deputies following. But not before one of them turned back and said clearly enough for all to hear, "You just signed your death warrant, lady." As the dust from their departure settled, Grace felt her legs begin to shake with delayed reaction, and she sat down heavily on the porch step, and Gochevan sat beside her, and John lowered himself down on her other side with a grunt of pain, and for a long moment none of them spoke, just sat there watching Cholina and Istas play in the yard as if the world had not just shifted irrevocably beneath their feet. "Well," John said finally, "I guess we're committed now." "I guess we are," Grace agreed, and Gochevan reached out and took her hand, his grip firm and certain, and she held on, tight, feeling the calluses on his palm, the warmth of his skin, and the unspoken promise that they would face whatever came next together. The days following Sheriff Hollis's retreat fell into a pattern that felt both natural and strange, with Gochevan arriving each morning before dawn, to work on Grace's struggling homestead, while his daughters helped with chores that ranged from feeding the chickens to hauling water from the nearly dry well. And Grace found herself learning to communicate through gestures and the few Blackfoot words that Cholina eagerly taught her while Istus remained quieter. Her fever from that first night returning in waves that left her pale and listless, despite Grace's best efforts with willow bark tea and cool compresses. It was on the fourth day, when Istus's fever spiked high enough to send Grace into genuine panic, that Dr. Emmett arrived at the cabin driving his buggy with the kind of reckless speed that spoke of a man fleeing his own conscience. And when he stumbled through the door, his hands were shaking and his face was gray with guilt that had been eating at him from the inside. Emmett examined Istus with gentle efficiency, and gradually the tension in his shoulders eased as he mixed a powder into water that he coaxed the girl to drink, announcing it was a respiratory infection that would break in a day or two. But then instead of leaving, he sat heavily at Grace's table and confessed in a voice barely above a whisper that Kingsley had been paying him to sign death certificates for homesteaders who died under suspicious circumstances. People who refused to sell their land, and then suddenly took sick or had accidents or just disappeared. 7 that I know of for certain, Emmett said, his voice cracking. Maybe more. I kept copies of all the certificates, hidden in my office. I'll testify to Judge Wainwright, but once I do this, Kingsley will kill all of us. John Novak appeared in the doorway then with exhaustion written across his weathered face, announcing that his well had gone completely dry that morning after 30 years, and so their unlikely alliance solidified 4 people bound together by desperation and a shared enemy. And over the next week they worked with furious purpose to document everything about Kingsley's operation, with Gochevan drawing detailed maps, John compiling lists of homesteaders who had sold under duress or died mysteriously, Emmett retrieving his cache of falsified death certificates, and Grace writing everything down in her careful schoolteacher's hand. But documentation was not enough. They needed to see the dam itself. And so, on a moonless night, Grace and Gochevan rode north toward Cold Spring, leaving the girls in John's care, and the ride took 3 hours through increasingly rough terrain until they crested the final ridge, and Grace saw Kingsley's massive dam stretching across the narrow canyon, a structure of timber and earth holding back water that should have been flowing freely to the prairie below. They spent an hour observing from their hidden vantage point, noting the dam's construction and the guards making their rounds. And Grace sketched what she could see in her notebook, her hands trembling with the knowledge that discovery meant death. And it was as they prepared to withdraw that disaster struck a stone dislodged beneath Grace's boot, tumbling down the slope with a clatter that seemed impossibly loud, and immediately the guards went alert, lanterns swinging toward their position, voices calling out in alarm. They ran, scrambling back down the ridge with pursuit rising behind them, men shouting and horses being saddled, and Grace's heart hammered as branches whipped at her face and roots tried to trip her feet. And they made it to their horses and rode hard through the darkness with rifle shots cracking behind them until they finally lost their pursuers in a maze of ravines and reached Grace's cabin as the sky lightened in the east, exhausted and shaken but alive. Relief turned to dread 3 days later when Harriet Bell arrived at midday, a widow from town whose round, pleasant face seemed creased with genuine concern as she offered to help with Grace's well troubles. And Grace wanted to believe in that kindness, so she invited Harriet in for coffee and let her guard down just enough to mention their plans to gather more evidence. Never noticing how the woman's eyes cataloged everything in the cabin, the maps on the table, Emmett's stack of death certificates, the sleeping forms of Cholina and Istus in the corner. It was only after Harriet left that Gochevan emerged from the fence line and said quietly that the woman had been terrified, not concerned, that she carried the fear of someone being forced to do something against her will, and the truth of his words settled into Grace's bones with sickening certainty. That night, as they sat around her table making plans for what they knew was coming, Gochevan told them the story he had kept locked inside for years, about his wife Aida, who had been killed by settlers while gathering herbs near the creek with baby Cholina strapped to her back, and how he had found them both lying in the grass, Aida dead and Cholina miraculously alive, screaming with lungs that promised she would survive even if her mother had not. "That is why I will not let anyone take my daughters," he said, his voice rough with old grief. "They are all I have left of her, and I would burn this whole territory to ash before I let them be harmed." Grace reached across the table and took his hand, and he gripped it like a lifeline. And in that moment something passed between them that was more than alliance, more than friendship, something that made her pulse quicken and her breath catch. The attack came 2 nights later, sudden and vicious, the sound of breaking glass and men shouting, and the orange glow of flames leaping from her barn into the night sky. And Grace grabbed her revolver while Gochevan seized his rifle, and they positioned themselves at the windows while John shepherded Cholina and Istas into the root cellar, and Emmett fumbled with ammunition boxes, his hands shaking but his jaw set with determination. "Grace Calder!" Flint-faced Mercer roared from the darkness. "Send out those half-breed brats and the evidence you've been gathering, and maybe we'll let you live." Grace's answer was a shot that shattered a lantern, and then the night erupted in gunfire. Muzzle flashes blooming like deadly flowers as Kingsley's men opened up on the cabin from 3 sides. Wood splintering and glass shattering as bullets punched through the walls, and Grace ducked below the windowsill while beside her Gochevan fired with methodical precision, each shot carefully aimed. In the root cellar, Cholina was crying but trying to be quiet, and Istas held her sister close and began singing something soft in Blackfoot, a song their mother must have taught them. And the sound of it cut through Grace's fear and filled her with fierce resolve. And Emmett managed to get shots off between reloading, and for 20 terrible minutes they held the cabin against an assault that should have overwhelmed them, until Grace realized they were simply delaying the inevitable. The barn was fully engulfed, the flames spreading to the fence line, and soon the cabin itself would catch. It was Gochevan who heard them first, his head snapping toward the north, and then Grace heard it too, the thunder of hooves, many horses moving fast, and for a moment she thought it was more of Kingsley's men. But then she saw the riders crest the rise and recognized the silhouettes of Blackfoot warriors, 24 at least, and at their head rode an older man whose bearing spoke of authority and whose war cry split the night like lightning. The attackers broke and ran, caught between the cabin's defenders and the warriors, and the battle that had seemed lost was suddenly won. Mercer and his men fleeing into the darkness with warriors in pursuit. And when the shooting finally stopped, Grace found herself sitting on the break floor with tears streaming down her face, though whether from relief or terror she could not say. Gochevan pulled open the root cellar door and lifted his daughters out, holding them both against his chest, and the older warrior who had led the rescue entered and spoke in rapid Blackfoot. And then Gochevan turned to Grace and said, "This is Running Bear, the elder of our band. I sent word 3 days ago that we might need help. He brought everyone who could fight." Running Bear looked at Grace with eyes that had seen too many wars and spoke in halting English. "You protect our children. We protect you. This is the old way. The right way." Grace tried to stand, but her legs would not hold her, and it was Gochevan who lifted her up, his arms solid around her waist, and she leaned against him and felt the steady beat of his heart, and knew that whatever came next they would face it together. And that terrible truth was now undeniable: this was war, and Kingsley would not stop until they were all dead or he was destroyed. News of the battle at Grace's homestead spread through the territory like wildfire, carried by witnesses who had seen the smoke and heard the gunfire, and within days the story had been embellished into legend. Some said 50 men had attacked the cabin. Others claimed the Blackfoot warriors had scalped Kingsley's men and left their bodies for the crows, but the truth was dramatic enough without embellishment, and it brought Judge Wainwright himself riding out from the territorial capital, with 2 federal marshals flanking him, and a determination to see justice done that surprised everyone who had grown accustomed to corrupt officials looking the other way. Grace and Gochevan met with the judge in John Novak's cabin, spreading their evidence across his scarred wooden table: the maps showing water diversion, the falsified death certificates, John's meticulous list of homesteaders forced out or killed, and Grace's detailed account of everything they had witnessed at the dam. And Wainwright studied it all with the careful attention of a man who understood that what he was looking at represented not just crimes but a systematic attempt to steal an entire region's lifeblood. "This is enough to hang Kingsley 10 times over," Wainwright said, his weathered face grim. "But you need to understand something. Nathan Kingsley has friends in Philadelphia, in Washington, men with money and influence who will fight to protect their investment in his operation. I can start an investigation. I can bring charges, but it will take time. And during that time, Kingsley will know he's cornered, and cornered men are the most dangerous kind." Grace felt her stomach twist with dread because she knew what the judge was really saying, that even with evidence and the law on their side, Kingsley might still destroy them before justice could be served, but Gochevan's hand found hers under the table and squeezed, and she drew strength from that touch. The ride back to her homestead took most of the day, and they arrived to find Harriet Bell's wagon parked outside, the widow woman sitting on Grace's porch with Cholina and Istas, braiding the girls' hair and telling them stories that made them laugh. And Grace felt guilt wash over her for having doubted the woman's intentions, for letting Gochevan's suspicions poison her against what seemed like genuine kindness. Harriet stayed for supper, helping Grace prepare the meal while Gochevan worked on repairing the burned sections of fence, and it was only later, after Harriet had left with promises to visit again soon, that Grace noticed her detailed notes about Judge Wainwright's involvement were missing from the stack of papers on her desk, and the sick realization of betrayal hit her like a physical blow. "She took them," Grace said, her voice hollow. "The notes about the judge, about when we're supposed to testify, Harriet took them." Gochevan's face darkened with an anger that was all the more terrifying for how controlled it remained, and he began checking the cabin systematically, looking for what else might have been compromised. And they discovered that the copy of Emmett's death certificates was also gone, along with one of the maps showing the dam's location and the routes they had used to approach it. The attack came not with violence but with something far worse. 3 days later, Cholina vanished while playing near the creek, and Grace, who had been watching from the cabin door, turned away for just a moment to stir the pot on the stove. And when she looked back, the girl was gone. Simply gone. No trace except her small footprints in the mud that ended abruptly where hoofprints began. And Grace's scream brought Gochevan running from the field, his face draining of color as he read the signs that Grace could not, seeing in the trampled grass and broken branches the story of his daughter's abduction. They found the note an hour later, pinned to the fence post with a knife, written in a crude hand that promised Cholina would be returned unharmed if Gochevan withdrew his testimony and convinced the other Blackfoot families to sign away their water rights. And if anyone contacted Judge Wainwright or the marshals, the girl would die. Grace watched Gochevan read that note, watched him read it 3 times as if the words might change, and then she watched him crumple it in his fist with such force that his hand shook, and when he looked at her, his eyes were filled with a grief and rage so profound that she knew he was reliving the moment he found his wife dead, was facing the possibility of losing another person he loved to the cruelty of men who saw other humans as obstacles to be removed. "We cannot give in to this," Grace said, though her own heart was breaking. "If we surrender now, Kingsley wins everything, and Cholina will never be safe. None of us will." Gochevan turned on her with fury. "That is easy for you to say. She is not your daughter. You did not carry her in your arms as a baby. You did not teach her to ride or sing or laugh." He stopped, his voice breaking, and Grace stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, holding him as he shook with the force of emotions he had spent a lifetime learning to control. It was Dr. Emmett who brought them the information that changed everything. Arriving at the cabin after midnight with news that he had confronted Harriet Bell in town, had seen her leaving the telegraph office with tear-stained cheeks, and had followed her home and demanded the truth, and she had broken down and confessed that Kingsley was holding her son Daniel in one of his mining camps up north, had been holding him for months as insurance of her cooperation, had threatened to kill the boy if she did not spy on Grace and report everything she learned. "She never wanted to betray you," Emmett said, his face haggard. "She's as much a victim as any of us. But now with Cholina taken, she's terrified that both children will die because of what she's done." The revelation complicated everything because Grace understood that kind of desperation, that terrible choice between betraying others or watching your own child suffer, and she could not hate Harriet for making the only choice any mother would make. But understanding did not change the fact that Cholina was still captive and time was running out. It was Gochevan who proposed the plan that was either brilliant or suicidal. Probably both. They would attack the dam itself with every warrior Running Bear could muster, would create enough chaos that Kingsley would have to bring all his men there to defend it, including whoever was guarding Cholina, and in the confusion they would rescue her and destroy the dam's gates, releasing the water and removing Kingsley's source of power in one coordinated strike. Grace contacted Judge Wainwright through a trusted intermediary, and the judge agreed to position his marshals near the dam to arrest Kingsley and his men once the fighting started, turning their desperate assault into a legal operation that would stand up in court. The night before the attack, Grace could not sleep. lying in her bed listening to Istas cry softly for her sister, and Gochevan sat beside the girl stroking her hair and singing the same song his wife had once sung, and Grace joined them and held Istas close. And Gochevan's hand found hers again, and they sat that way until dawn. A makeshift family held together by crisis and commitment, and something deeper that neither of them had yet put into words. The assault on the dam began at first light, with Blackfoot warriors approaching from 3 directions while John Novak and a dozen homesteaders who had decided they would rather fight than lose everything, created a diversion by attacking Kingsley's ranch house to the south, and Grace rode with Gochevan and Running Bear, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest, Samuel's revolver heavy in her hand, and a Winchester rifle strapped to her saddle. The guards at the dam were expecting trouble but not the coordinated fury that descended on them, and within minutes the careful defense Flint-Face Mercer had organized collapsed into chaos as warriors poured through gaps in the perimeter and settlers attacked from unexpected angles. And in the confusion, Grace saw her chance and broke away from the main assault, riding hard for the camp where she had spotted prisoners being held. And there in a small tent tied to a support pole was Cholina, her face bruised but her eyes still fierce, still fighting. Grace cut the ropes with her knife and pulled the girl onto her horse, and they were racing back toward the main battle when Mercer himself rode out of the smoke and dust, his scarred face twisted with rage, his rifle coming up to aim, and Grace fired first, her shot taking him in the shoulder and spinning him from his saddle, and she did not stop to see if he would rise again, just rode with Cholina clinging to her waist until they reached the relative safety of where Running Bear had established their position. On the dam platform itself, Gochevan had found Kingsley, and the rancher fought with the desperation of a man who saw his empire crumbling. But Gochevan was fighting for his family and there was no desperation in him, only cold precision as he drove Kingsley back against the control mechanisms for the dam's gates. "You think you can take what's mine?" Kingsley snarled, blood streaming from a cut above his eye. "I own this territory. I own everything. You own nothing." Gochevan's response was to twist using Kingsley's momentum against him and throw the rancher to the platform floor. And when Mercer, despite his wounded shoulder, raised his rifle to shoot Gochevan, Grace, who had just delivered Cholina to safety, raised her revolver and fired again, this time hitting Mercer square in the chest and watching him fall. Judge Wainwright's marshals emerged then from their hidden positions and swarmed over Kingsley's remaining men, taking them into custody, and Wainwright himself climbed onto the dam platform to arrest Kingsley personally, reading charges that included water theft, conspiracy, kidnapping, attempted murder, and a dozen other crimes that would see the rancher imprisoned for decades. Gochevan opened the dam's gates, not destroying them but adjusting them to allow fair distribution, and Grace stood beside him watching the water pour through in a controlled flow that would restore the creek below, bring life back to the land. And as she stood there with Cholina safe in her arms and Istas running toward them calling for her sister, she felt something break open inside her. Some dam of her own that had been holding back emotion since Samuel died, and she wept with relief and joy and exhaustion. The aftermath unfolded over the following weeks with a speed that surprised everyone who had expected territorial justice to move with its usual, glacial pace. Kingsley was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison. Sheriff Hollis received 10 years for corruption, and Harriet Bell was not charged in recognition of her cooperation and the duress under which she had acted, though the weight of her betrayal drove her to leave for Denver to start fresh with her son, who Wainwright's marshals rescued from Kingsley's mining camp. The dam was modified under proper supervision to allow fair water access for all, and Kingsley's liquidated estate funded public water systems for both settlers and Blackfoot families. And Judge Wainwright issued an injunction recognizing Cold Spring as common property under territorial law accessible regardless of race. Grace stood at the edge of her property on a bright spring morning watching water flow through her repaired irrigation ditch, the wheat she had planted already sprouting in tender green shoots, and behind her she heard Gochevan and John working together on the lean-to they were building for when the girls visited, which was increasingly most of the time as Cholina and Istas had claimed Grace's cabin as a second home. Gochevan set down his hammer and walked to Grace, his face peaceful in a way she had not seen before, and he said quietly, "It is finished, the lean-to. Everything. We are safe. We are together." But Grace smiled and said, Not quite. You have not asked me properly. Understanding dawned in his eyes, and he took her hands in his with a grip that was warm and steady. Grace called her. You saved my daughters. You saved my life. You fought beside me when no one else would, and I have nothing to offer you but hard work and uncertain days, and a family that straddles two worlds. But if you will have me, I will stand beside you for the rest of my days. I will protect you and honor you and love you with everything I have. Will you marry me? Grace felt tears sting her eyes, but they were tears of joy. Yes. 1,000 times. Yes, she said, and he pulled her into his arms and she buried her face in his shoulder. And around them the prairie stretched vast and endless, but for the first time in years Grace did not feel dwarfed by it, but rooted, anchored, home. That evening they gathered for a celebration with Dr. Emmett, bringing his fiddle, and families from both the town and the Blackfoot camp coming together to share food and stories. And it was not perfect because old prejudices did not vanish overnight, but it was a beginning, fragile and hopeful. As the sun set, casting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Grace stood with Gochevan watching Cholina and Istis play with other children, both white and Blackfoot, their voices mingling without the weight of their parents' histories, and the creek sang its steady song full and strong once more. We did it, Grace said quietly, and Gochevan agreed. And tomorrow we begin again. And Grace leaned into him as he wrapped an arm around her shoulders, and they stood together as the stars began to appear one by one in the darkening sky. And the future was uncertain, as it always had been on this harsh and beautiful land, but they would face it together. A family forged not by blood alone, but by courage and sacrifice and love earned through fire. And in that moment, under the vast Montana sky, Grace Calder felt something she had not felt in a very long time: hope. Not just for herself, but for the life they would build together, for the children they would raise, and for the land they would share. And the water thieves had been stopped, the dam was opened, and the prairie at last could breathe.